everybody. In this video, we're going to talk about how to multiply fractions. So to start off our discussion, let's start with an easy example where we multiply a fraction and a whole number together. So if we have the fraction 1/4 times 3, what that means is we are going to make 3 copies of 1/4. So on a number line, what that would look like is we would go 1/4, that's 1 copy of 1/4. Then a second copy of 1/4 would be right there. And then the third copy would be right here, which is the 3/4 mark. And so 1/4 times 3 equals 3/4. Now, if we were to do 3 times 1/4, what that means is that we have 1/4 of a group of 3. So we would say, okay, well, here's 3. And we don't have a whole group of 3. Instead, we have a fourth of a group of 3. So one way I could figure this out is I could split 3 in half, which would be 1.5 right here. And then if I split that in half, that would equal 3/4, which makes sense because multiplication is commutative, meaning we can switch the order. But the visualization of 1/4 times 3 or 3 times 1/4 looks very different because of what multiplication means. When we do 1/4 times 3, we're making 3 copies of 1/4. And when we do 3 times 1/4, we're making a fourth of a copy of the number 3. So now let's go ahead and extend this to multiplying fractions. So I'm going to start off by multiplying the fraction 3/4 times 2, and then I'm going to do 3/4 times a half. So if I did 3/4 times 2, that basically means I'm making 2 copies of 3/4. So I would go to 3/4, that's 1 copy of 3/4. And then if I make another copy of 3/4, that would equal 1.5. Or another way you could think about this is that this would be 6/4, which reduces to 3/2, which equals 1 1/2 if you change it to a mixed number. So that's what happens if you make 2 copies of 3/4. But if you make a half of a copy of 3/4, that means you would go to the 3/4 mark and split that in half. Now, notice that the halfway mark is in between the 1/4 and 2/4 or halfway mark. And so in order to figure out what fraction that is, let's split all of the other units between 0 and 1 in half and count how many there are. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 total, which makes sense because if you split fourths in half, that's going to give you eighths. And this mark, that's the 1/2 mark of 3/4, is the 3/8 mark. And so that tells us that 3/4 times 1/2 equals 3/8. And if you look at this, notice that 3 times 1 equals 3, and 4 times 2 equals 8. So when you multiply fractions, you just multiply the numbers on the top and the numbers on the bottom to get your answer. And that's true even if you're multiplying by a whole number, because we could think about the number 2 as being the fraction 2/1, and 3 times 2 equals 6, and 4 times 1 equals 4. So in a lot of ways, multiplying fractions is even easier than adding fractions because you don't have to worry about finding common denominators. So let's talk about why you don't need common denominators. And in my opinion, the easiest way to see why this works the way that it does is to use an area model. So area can be used to model multiplication. And a simple example of that would be a rectangle that is 3 units by 2 units, if you look at the length and the width. And the area, or the number of square units within that rectangle, is equal to 3 times 2, which in this case would be 6. So if we wanted to multiply 2 fractions, like 3/4 and 1/2, in this case, we're going to end up with a fraction of a square unit. So let's say this was like a square inch or a square foot or something like that. If we had a rectangle that was 3/4 by 1/2 units, then we would say, okay, well, if we split up this side length into fourths and the rectangle is 3/4 long, then that's going to be one side length of my rectangle. Then if I split my other side in half and my rectangle is 1/2 of a unit long, then the rectangle that I'm looking to find the area of is this rectangle right here. So the way that we figure out how many square units are in this rectangle, which it's going to be a fraction because it's smaller than the whole square unit, is we just basically extend these lines here. And we say, okay, well, if I split up the whole rectangle into fourths, and then I split up the rectangle into halves, these little rectangles are eighths of the rectangle because we have 4 columns of 2 rows. And so that's why you multiply the denominators together to get 8, is because there's 8 of these rectangles within the square unit. And then for the top part, the rectangle that we're looking at is this part right here. And that only encompasses 3 of the little rectangles. And so that's why you do 3 times 1, because you have 3 columns of 1 row. And that's an area model that shows why you need to multiply both the numerators and the denominators of a fraction when you're multiplying fractions together. So why don't you guys try drawing an area model for this multiplication problem and use the area model to figure out what the answer is for 2/3 times 3/8. So pause this video, write it down in your notebooks, and then restart the video to see how I would solve this one. Okay, so to draw an area model, let's first draw a square unit. So again, this could be square inches, square feet, even a square mile. But this is going to be 1 unit by 1 unit. And if I want to draw a rectangle that's 2/3 of a unit long, I'm going to split one of my side lengths up into 3 pieces, and my rectangle is going to end at the second one. Then for the eighths, I'm going to split the other side length up into eighths. So that should look something like that. And my rectangle is going to be 3/8 units wide. So the rectangle that I'm looking at is a rectangle that's 3/8 wide and 2/3 long. So this is the rectangle that I'm looking at. And if I extend these lines like this and extend these along here, we can see that we have 3 columns of 8 rows, which means that the number of these rectangles that I've drawn that we have total in the entire square unit is going to be 24. And then inside of the rectangle that I'm trying to find the area of, I would have 6 of those rectangles. And so 2/3 times 3/8 would equal 6/24. And that can actually be reduced because both 6 and 24 have a common factor of 6. And so I could reduce that to be 1/4. And this brings us to a trick that you can use to make it easier to multiply fractions. Because when you multiply fractions, you multiply the numerators together and the denominators. So like you do 2 times 3 and 3 times 8. But because multiplication is commutative, which means you can switch the order of the factors, you could think about this as 3 times 2 over 3 times 8, which means that you could reduce the fractions before you actually multiply them together. Because 3 over 3 is the same as 1 over 1, and 2 over 8 is the same thing as 1 over 4. And so if you want to, you can reduce before you multiply because multiplication is commutative. So just like we got on the last slide, the answer to this problem is 1/4. But you can teach your students that if they want to, they can reduce the multiplication before they multiply to make it so they don't have to reduce bigger numbers after they multiply. So that's how you multiply fractions. If you have any questions, let me know. And I hope you guys have a great day.